I was tired and I was ready for Shabbat. I knew that after Friday night services ended, I had a couple days to catch my breath. Yes, a long weekend, even during a pandemic, is important. And given that we're already 2 months into the stay-at-home order, well, I just needed a break. I was planning time in my garden and time in my pool and time with my daughters and time with my wife because even though we lived in the same house, we were all in our respective corners, taking classes and doing internships and fulfilling our professional responsibilities. Yep, I needed a few days where I could wrap my head around the prior 2 months and just be. But first, a service. It was April 28th, and a few days earlier had been Yom HaShoah. And as is our tradition at Kol Tikva, we honor this day of memory during a nearby Shabbat service. As part of this year's service, congregants from the creative writing class were sharing poems and reflections focused on the Holocaust. Their words were beautiful. Everything proceeded so perfectly until I got to the Mourner's Kaddish. As I spoke, an intruder scrawled over our digital prayer book, placing a swastika and a phrase that I won't repeat over the words of the Kaddish. Sam Klein, who was our intern at the time, notified me of the intrusion, and working together, we removed the intruder, but our efforts were not good enough. This intruder returned moments later, another expulsion, this time locking our meeting, kept this bigot out of our meeting permanently. So this bigot could not return with his swastika and his profanities. I then returned to introducing the Kaddish using these words. No matter how racist or anti-Semitic someone might be, they will never stop us from remembering those who passed. They will never stop us from saying the names of those whose names need to be said. They will never stop us. No, they will never stop us from fulfilling our commitments to Judaism. No matter how much I attempted to push the image out of my head, I couldn't. That swastika and those words scrawled across the digital prayer book, I kept seeing the 60 windows, the 100 congregants frozen in place as Sam and I attempted to remove the image and expel the anti-Semite. We had succeeded in our short-term goals, and we were able to finish the service with a sense of dignity. But those moments of hatred had repercussions that continued within our community for quite a while. From anger to fear, many emotions were felt by community members, both those present and those that heard about it later. The shock we felt was immense. And over the past months, I've thought a lot about the rise of anti-Semitism in this country. And I've shared my reflections and what I've learned with fellow rabbis so they can protect their communities. I know that anti-Semitism is quite real. My weekend went from one of planned relaxation to one of action. There are many partners involved in the aftermath. Congregants, my fellow clergy, the Federation, the Community Security Initiative, the police, neighboring religious institutions, and the Board of Rabbis. At the end of the day, the actions taken against us were considered a hate incident, not a hate crime. An incident. While disgusting, these actions were not illegal. I truly believe that if someone desecrates virtually, it should be treated as if the desecration happened physically. The law needs to be changed, but that is a discussion for another day and another sermon. Recently, I chaired a Board of Rabbis gathering where experts from CSI, AJU, and the Anti-Defamation League shared their knowledge with rabbis from Reform, Reconstructionist, Conservative, and Orthodox communities. They confirmed what we already knew. The number of anti-Semitic incidents is increasing worldwide. But they also talked about the need to join with Black and Brown communities in their struggles. They spoke about the interconnectedness of all persecuted minorities. They talked about how we need to assist one another. And as they spoke, I began to struggle with the decision I made last year, back when George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were still alive, and Jacob Blake was not paralyzed, back when protesters were not filling the streets and a virus had not sent us into isolation. You see, last year at Kol Nidre, I spoke about anti-Semitism. I spoke about how minority communities and their leadership were realizing they needed to help the Jewish community. And by supporting the Jewish community against bigotry, hate, and violence, they were actually, helping their own communities. I specifically referenced how more and more leaders in the black community were standing up for Jewish Americans. I did 5 drafts of that sermon. And if you look at draft 4 and draft 5, you'll see I made a major cut. And what was that cut? It was a section I wrote on racism and its relationship to anti-Semitism. Yep, I took it out. I decided that I needed to focus on what was happening to the Jewish community and how others were helping us. I decided not to speak about what we could and should be doing for others. I played it safe. And by playing it safe, I received a lot of kudos. A lot of kudos from a wide spectrum of congregants. Given all that has happened over the past 6 months, I made an error. I should have balanced what others were doing to support us with what we were doing and could be and should be doing for others. But I felt people wanted to hear about problems that were directly affecting them. Hence my focus. It makes sense if you understand how the human brain works. You see, we are designed to focus on our own problems and to the best of our ability avoid seeing the problems of others. It's the way we are wired. Literally, if you placed yourself into an fMRI machine, which images metabolic function, you'd see that the farther an issue resides from you, the less your brain wants to react to it. If you think about yourself on an fMRI machine, a certain part of your brain will light up like Times Square. And if you think about family members, it lights up a little bit less. And if you think about people with whom you have no connection, it will barely register on the scan. Yep, if you think about how anti-Semitism affects you, it lights up. But if you think about racism, probably a lot less so, unless you're a person of color. I admit it, it's hard for us to consider others when we have our own source, our own problems. Let's admit it, right now it's really hard to think beyond the security of our own families. But we're being affected by anti-Semitism. In late August, a Chabad in Delaware was set on fire and it was determined to be arson. And it was far from a major story. It was buried. So yes, maybe we should be thinking about anti-Semitism. But in order to slow or reverse anti-Semitic sentiment, we also need allies. And allyship goes in both directions. That means we need to fight racism in order for other minority groups to help us fight anti-Semitism. We need to see the similarity of our issues. And if you can't see the similarities, you don't understand the story of the Jewish people. We have been second-class citizens throughout this world for most of Jewish history. We have been abused. We have been murdered. We have been blamed. We have been the other. And so have the black and brown communities when they've lived here in the United States. In the past, I've spoken about the little a, big A anti-Semitism paradigm. Big A represents blatantly anti-Semitic acts. Little a represents microaggressions. Little a anti-Semites don't realize their actions are hurtful or perpetuate a stereotype. When your feelings are slighted, they say things like, "I was just joking. You know I like you. I wasn't talking about you in specific." Big A anti-Semites are actively degrading and violating Jews any way they can in a planned and deliberate manner. Big A and little a anti-Semitism are found on both the extreme left and right side of our political spectrum. So little a and big A, I borrowed these ideas from the concept of little r and big R racism. Small r racism is what happens whenever someone from one race hates or negatively stereotypes the members of another race. Anyone can be a small r racist. White people, black people, brown people can all be small r racists as long as they dislike another racial group. Big R racism, it is systemic and institutional. Only those with a significant power advantage over another group can be big R racist. In other words, minorities with no power cannot be big R racist because they have no institutional power. I'm sure most of you are thinking or whispering to one another or texting one another, "I'm not a racist, big R or little r." Great, good for you. You're not a racist. You proclaim this honor to your family and friends over a glass of wine, or to your coworkers over a cup of coffee, or even during a Zoom meeting. But let me ask you, are you an anti-racist? Are you an anti-racist? If you're not a racist or an anti-racist, then you stand in the middle. And while you might say you're not racist, you're not getting involved, so you let bigotry flourish. Being neutral allows evil to take control. Do I need to remind you of the Germans and Poles who said, I didn't work in the camps. I didn't do anything to hurt anyone. Even as they saw Jews taken from their homes and shoved into cattle cars, even as they smelled the smoke from death camps. I can't count the number of times that I've spoken to this community or written an email or chatted directly with a congregant about social justice issues that are key elements of being a Reformed Jew. And so often the response is, Rabbi, I agree with you, but it's not that important to me. Agreeing with me is lovely. It makes me feel good. But thinking you can sit on the sidelines as the world finds itself in turmoil is not where you should be as a Jew or a human being. Doing nothing, standing in the middle, letting it be someone else's issue will leave us on the wrong side of history, especially when it comes to race relations. And author Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he argues that we should return the word racist back to its proper usage. The term racist is not the equivalent of a slur, it is descriptive, and the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it and then dismantle it. Being an anti-racist is simple. If you're in the middle, take one small step in order to place yourself into the anti-racist camp. We can gently say to those around us who are using improper language, your words and actions need to be reflected upon. Each person is your brother or sister, and we need to see them as such and then to defend them just as we defend our own families. And if you want, you can do even more. You can find online petitions. You can find rallies to attend if you think they're safe. You can write your congresspeople. You can look around and say, what is needed today? Fighting racism is a step toward building alliances with minority groups who can share our battle against anti-Semitism. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. I swear that even with the passing of my father when I was only 6, I had a pretty good life. I played by the creek at the end of my street. I went blackberry picking in the woods nearby, well, even though my mom told me not to. I had free run of the neighborhood and would come home at sunset for dinner since no one at that time had a cell phone. I felt protected. But, as I look back, I realized I was living in a world surrounded by racism. I think about classmates that had Confederate flags adorning their cars and bedrooms. I think about all the Civil War statues that I passed walking through town with my friends. I think about, how I was taught that the Southern soldiers were gentlemen, while the Northern soldiers were marauding barbarians. I think about how my school district was integrated, but my high school placed 90% of the black students into the lower level classes. I think about my best friend in high school and how we decided it would be cool to use derogatory names for one another. And we tried it for about 1 minute and hated the way it felt because he was black and I was Jewish. And I'm sure he has never used the K word again, and I have never used the N word since that experience. I grew up in Louisville, living a protected, privileged life, even as my mother struggled to support us as a single parent. I didn't see the systemic racism that surrounded me. But today I do. As Reformed Jews, we need to follow the lead of our movement and speak out. Elie Wiesel's repeated trope, we need to get involved in every injustice. As he wrote in his Nobel Prize speech, we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Is your neutrality helping the oppressor? Is your silence encouraging the tormentor? We need to fight racism if we desire minority groups to join us in our battle against anti-Semitism. Yes, we know that. More importantly, we need to fight racism because it's the right thing to do. When we actively fight racism, we are anti-racist. When we actively fight racism, we are creating a better world, not just for those of color, but for all of us. When we fight racism, we are anti-racist, which is what every Jew should be. Shana Tova.